My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. 2 weeks after I buried my husband Elijah, I attended the third birthday party of my best friend's son. She stood in front of Atlanta's elite society and announced that her son was my husband's child. She demanded half of his $300 million fortune and slammed a will on the table. I simply smiled and said okay while trying to hold back my laughter because my husband was actually completely sterile. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up, I was always the scapegoat who never quite fit into the perfect image everyone expected. But what happened next changed everything. The afternoon sun beat down on the manicured lawns of the Buckhead Country Club. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne and sparkling cider. It was a flawless Atlanta afternoon designed specifically for the Black elite to see and be seen. We were supposed to be celebrating little Trey turning 3 years old. But the atmosphere felt thick and suffocating. Elijah had died suddenly just 14 days prior. My heart was still a raw, open wound, and wearing a polite smile felt like lifting boulders. I wore a simple black dress standing near the edge of the patio, hoping to blend into the background. I had only come because Sasha insisted. Sasha was my best friend of 15 years. We met as freshmen at Spelman College before I dropped out. She went on to pledge Alpha Kappa Alpha, become a successful pediatrician, and marry a prominent surgeon. She was the picture of Black excellence. I was the college dropout who ran a dusty thrift bookstore downtown. Or at least that was the narrative they all believed. I took a sip of sparkling water and watched Sasha move through the crowd. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that hugged her perfectly. She tapped her crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon. The sharp chiming sound cut through the gentle hum of jazz music and affluent chatter. The entire patio fell silent. Members of the local Jack and Jill chapter turned their attention to the center of the lawn. Prominent politicians and alumni network presidents stopped their conversations. "Thank you all for being here today," Sasha began. Her voice echoed loudly across the patio. "We are here to celebrate my beautiful boy Trey. But today is also a day for truth and reclaiming what is rightfully ours." I felt a slight shift in the air. Sasha locked eyes with me across the crowd. Her gaze was not filled with the warmth of a best friend consoling a new widow. It was cold and calculating. A predatory gleam shone in her eyes. "Many of you know that we recently lost a pillar of our community." Sasha continued, taking a step toward me. Elijah was a brilliant venture capitalist. He built a $300 million empire. He was a man who valued legacy above all else. But he carried a heavy burden. He was trapped in a marriage with a woman who could not give him an heir. He desperately wanted a child to carry on his bloodline. The murmurs rippled through the crowd. I stood perfectly still. My grip tightened on my water glass. People turned to stare at me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disgust. Sasha reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, white document. She held it high for everyone to see. "Elijah and I shared a deep, undeniable connection," Sasha declared loudly. "We found comfort in each other. And out of that beautiful connection, my son Trey was born. I have the DNA test results right here in my hand. Trey is Elijah's biological son and true heir." The collective gasp from the country club elite was deafening. Whispers erupted immediately. I could hear the sharp intakes of breath from the women in pastel sundresses. But Sasha was not finished. She pulled out a second document bound in heavy blue legal paper. She slammed it down onto the gift table, shattering a glass vase in the process. "And this is Elijah's final will and testament," Sasha announced. Her voice rose to a triumphant crescendo. He updated it just months before his tragic death. He left exactly 50% of his entire $300 million estate to his true bloodline. He wanted Trey to have the life he deserved. "Maya, you have been living a lie. You are sitting on a throne that does not belong to you. It is time to step down." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her performance, the crowd parted. Vivian stepped forward. Vivian was Elijah's older sister, She was a prominent federal judge who wore her elite status like a weapon. Her husband Darnell flanked her like a loyal guard dog. They marched directly toward me. Their faces were twisted with righteous indignation and superiority. "I always knew you were a fraud, Maya," Vivian sneered. Her voice carried the harsh tone she usually reserved for the courtroom. Elijah always wanted a woman of pedigree to bear his children. He wanted someone who understood our world. Someone with a proper background. Not a college dropout who spends her days organizing donated paperbacks in a dusty thrift bookstore. Darnell crossed his arms over his expensive tailored suit. He looked down at me with absolute contempt. "You have been a leech on this family for far too long, Maya. Elijah was a genius, and you dragged him down. Now the truth is out. His legacy will not be squandered by someone who does not even know how to properly manage a portfolio. Hand over the estate keys. Give us the access codes to the trust accounts right now." "You never belonged with us," Vivian added, taking another step closer. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are an embarrassment to our family name. You sneaked your way into our circle, but you could never wash off your low-class roots. Sasha is a doctor. She is a true equal to my brother. She has the social standing to properly manage his wealth and raise his son in the environment he intended. You need to pack whatever cheap clothes you brought into this marriage and disappear. Leave the luxury cars and the Buckhead mansion. They belong to his true family now." The entire country club watched in hushed anticipation. They waited for me to break down. They expected me to fall to my knees and cry. They wanted a chaotic scene where the unpolished widow begged for mercy. They wanted to see the impostor stripped of her unearned crown. I looked at Sasha, my best friend of 15 years, the woman I had supported through medical school, the woman whose child I had babysat. She stood there clutching a forged piece of paper, looking incredibly smug. I looked at Vivian and Darnell, the in-laws who had looked down on me since the day Elijah introduced me. They were ready to throw me to the wolves to protect their precious social standing and get their hands on a fortune. I took a deep breath. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my drink. Instead, I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. I calmly set my water glass down on a nearby cocktail table. I smoothed the front of my simple black dress. I looked Vivian directly in the eyes. Then I turned my gaze to Darnell and finally to Sasha. "Okay," I said. My voice was quiet but completely steady. It carried perfectly in the dead silence of the patio. "Take it. Take all of it." Sasha blinked. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She clearly had not anticipated this reaction. Vivian frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. Darnell shifted his weight, looking suspicious. I did not wait for them to recover their wits. I turned around and began walking toward the exit. The crowd of elites parted for me silently. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. I walked across the pristine lawn, leaving the lavish birthday party behind. I walked past the valet stand and out to the overflow parking lot, where I had parked my beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat, shutting out the world. The absolute foolishness of their terrible greed was truly astounding. They thought they held all the cards. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a prepaid burner phone. I typed a quick message to my private attorney. "Activate Protocol Olympus," I typed. "Lock them in." I smiled. After my husband's funeral, I attended my best friend's son's 3rd birthday party. She announced that her son was my husband's child, meaning she was entitled to half of his $300 million fortune. She even showed me his will. I simply said okay while trying to hold back my laughter because my husband was actually completely sterile. "My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and I am about to dismantle the entire Atlanta elite." I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old Honda Civic and watched the valet attendants at the Buckhead Country Club scramble to retrieve luxury vehicles for the panicked guests. Sasha's grand revelation had sent shockwaves through the manicured lawns, and I knew the gossip was already spreading through every exclusive group chat in the city. I smiled as I sent the activation text to my lawyer. Protocol Olympus was officially in motion. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the country club parking lot. I needed to see my mother. Clarice Vance lived in a sprawling brick estate in the affluent Cascade neighborhood. It was a house Elijah and I had purchased for her shortly after our wedding, a gesture to keep her comfortable and quiet. She had spent the last 5 years filling it with expensive art-imported rugs and the quiet desperation of a woman trying to buy her way into high society. The drive took 20 minutes. I navigated the familiar winding roads lined with towering oak trees and pristine landscaping. My phone buzzed relentlessly in the passenger seat. Notifications lit up the screen with missed calls from Vivian, angry text messages from Darnell, and frantic alerts from the various social committees Sasha was a part of. I ignored all of them. I pulled into the circular driveway of my mother's estate. Her silver Mercedes SUV was parked haphazardly near the front steps, the trunk popped open. I stepped out of the car and walked up the stone pathway. The heavy mahogany front doors were unlocked. I pushed them open and stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled of expensive floral candles and lemon polish. I could hear the frantic clicking of heels against the hardwood floors upstairs. I walked past the formal living room, a space Clarice kept perfectly staged, like a museum exhibit specifically to impress the other Jack and Jill mothers. I climbed the sweeping staircase, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. I found my mother in her master suite. The room was a chaotic mess of discarded designer clothing and open luggage. Clarice was frantically shoving silk blouses and cashmere sweaters into a massive Louis Vuitton trunk. She wore a tailored cream pantsuit, her hair perfectly pressed, completely at odds with her panicked movements. She froze when she saw me standing in the doorway. Her eyes darted from my face to my simple black dress, her expression instantly twisting into a familiar mask of disdain. "Sasha just called me," Clarice snapped. Her voice was sharp and accusing. She turned back to her closet and ripped a handful of dresses off their hangers. "You need to surrender the assets quietly. Do not make this a public spectacle, Maya. We have already endured enough embarrassment." I leaned against the doorframe. I crossed my arms and watched the woman who had given birth to me prioritize her social calendar over my shattered marriage. "Surrender the assets," I repeated. My voice was perfectly calm. "Your son-in-law has been dead for 2 weeks. Your best friend's daughter just claimed he fathered a child behind my back, and your first instinct is to tell me to surrender." Clarice slammed a stack of clothes into the trunk. "Sasha is a doctor. She comes from a good family. She pledged the right sorority. She is an Alpha Kappa Alpha woman with a pristine reputation. She has the social standing to manage that kind of money. You are just a disappointment. You always have been. Why could you not be more like her?" Her words were meant to cut, but I felt absolutely nothing. This was the same woman who had criticized my every move since childhood, the same woman who had screamed at me when I dropped out of Spelman College. She never cared that I left school because I was brilliant enough to code a revolutionary algorithm on my own. She only cared that she could no longer brag about my degree at her high tea parties. She hated that I ran a dusty thrift bookstore downtown instead of attending charity galas. She never understood that the bookstore was just a front, a quiet place for me to operate the greatest financial empire in the state. "You are packing in a hurry," I observed, ignoring her insult. "Where exactly are you going?" Clarice avoided my eyes. She grabbed a velvet jewelry box and stuffed it into her tote bag. "I am going to Vivian's mountain house in Asheville. The family needs to regroup and present a unified front. The media is going to be all over this by morning. We cannot have reporters knocking on this door asking questions about your unstable behavior." "Unified front," I said. I stepped into the room. "You mean Vivian and Darnell's unified front? The same people who just tried to publicly humiliate me at a 3-year-old's birthday party. They are protecting Elijah's legacy," Clarice shot back. She finally stopped packing and glared at me. "A legacy you clearly have no respect for. Elijah needed an heir. He needed a child who could carry on the family name with dignity. Sasha gave him that. You gave him nothing but headaches and dusty old books. You lack the grace to handle this situation. You need to step aside before you drag my name through the mud along with yours." I walked over to her vanity table. I picked up a silver-framed photograph of Clarice and Sasha at a charity gala. I was nowhere in the picture. You really hate me that much, I stated. It was not a question. You would rather side with the woman trying to rob me blind just because she wears the right letters on her jacket. Clarice snatched the frame out of my hand. I am being realistic, Maya. You cannot fight Vivian in a courtroom. She is a federal judge. Darnell has the best corporate lawyers in Atlanta on retainer. They will crush you, and I will not go down with your sinking ship. She walked over to her trunk and zipped it shut with a harsh metallic sound. In fact, I have already spoken to Vivian's legal team. I am testifying in probate court next week. The room went dead silent. I stared at my mother. The sheer magnitude of her betrayal hung in the air between us. You are testifying against me, I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet. I am doing what is necessary, Clarice said. She lifted her chin, trying to project authority. I will tell the judge the truth. I will tell them that you were an emotionally unstable wife, that you were negligent, that your constant depression and erratic behavior drove Elijah into Sasha's arms. It is the only way the court will invalidate your claim to the estate and pass control to Sasha and the child. You are going to commit perjury, I said. You are going to lie under oath to help them steal my money, just so Vivian will keep inviting you to the country club. It is Elijah's money, Clarice screamed. Her perfect composure finally cracked. It is Elijah's empire. You are just the woman who happened to marry him. You never deserved any of this. I will not let you ruin my life because you are too stubborn to know when you have been beaten. I did not yell back. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me into something manageable. She was so blinded by the glare of the Atlanta elite that she could not see the executioner standing right in front of her. Before I could respond, a massive crash echoed from the first floor. The sound of heavy boots stomping across the hardwood floors reverberated up the staircase. Clarice gasped and stepped back against her closet door. Maya, what is that? She whispered, panic replacing her anger. I turned toward the bedroom door, just as heavy footsteps reached the second-floor landing. Darnell appeared in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, his designer suit jacket unbuttoned. He was not alone. 4 men in tactical black uniforms flanked him. Private security, the kind you hire when you are doing something highly illegal and need muscle to ensure there are no witnesses. Darnell looked past me to Clarice. Good to see you are packing, Clarice. Vivian is waiting for you in Asheville. He turned his attention to me. His eyes were cold and filled with arrogant triumph. But you are not going anywhere, Maya. What is the meaning of this, Darnell? I asked. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly relaxed. You are trespassing in my mother's home. This is not your mother's home anymore, Darnell sneered. He snapped his fingers, and 2 of the security guards stepped past him into the hallway. We are here to seize Elijah's personal servers. We know he kept the physical backups of the venture capital firm's master files in the hidden safe room behind this master suite. We are taking them. All of them. He stepped into the bedroom, invading my space. You thought you were so smart walking out of the country club today. Vivian and I knew you would try to lock us out of the network. We know you do not have the clearance to authorize a full asset transfer without the master physical keys. We are taking the drives, Maya. We will drain the accounts by midnight. Sasha will have her money, Vivian will have her legacy, and you will have absolutely nothing. Clarice watched the exchange with wide eyes. She gripped her handbag tightly, clearly terrified of Darnell's aggressive intrusion, yet entirely unwilling to defend me. Darnell smirked, expecting me to panic. He expected me to beg. He expected the uneducated thrift store owner to finally break under the weight of his corporate intimidation. I tilted my head, looking at him with genuine amusement. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out my phone. The screen displayed a single green check mark. Protocol Olympus was complete. I looked back at Darnell. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. You can try, Darnell, I said. My voice was smooth like glass. You can tear down these walls and take every piece of hardware you find, but you might not like what the firewall does to your bank accounts when you plug those drives in. Darnell frowned. His arrogant facade slipped for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? You really think Elijah built a $300 million venture capital firm? I asked. I took a step toward him, forcing him to hold his ground. Did you really think a black man in his 30s built a tech empire without a silent partner? Darnell stared at me. The security guards shifted uncomfortably in the hallway. Clarice let out a small, confused breath. Elijah was a wonderful husband, I said. I kept my eyes locked on Darnell, but he was not a coder. He was a face. A beautiful, well-educated, highly pedigreed face that I used to navigate a corporate world that would never take a young, unpolished black woman seriously. Elijah did not build Aegis Nexus. I did. He was my employee. Darnell scoffed, but I could hear the slight tremor of doubt in his voice. You are lying. You sell used books. The bookstore is a front, Darnell. I took another step forward. You are standing in a house I bought with cash I earned. You are looking for servers that I built, and you just triggered a security protocol that I designed. Go ahead and take the drives. The moment they cross the property line, the tracking software will instantly route every cent of your personal firm's liquidity into an offshore holding account that you can never touch. Darnell's face turned completely ashen. He looked at the security guards, then back at me. He pulled out his phone, his hands suddenly shaking as he frantically dialed his chief financial officer. I turned to my mother. She was pressed against the closet door, staring at me as if she were looking at a ghost. You packed your bags for Asheville, Clarice, I said quietly. I suggest you start driving, because by tomorrow morning there will not be a single elite family in Atlanta willing to look you in the eye. I walked past Darnell, leaving him shouting into his phone as his financial world began to collapse around him. The game had officially changed and I was holding all the pieces. Less than 12 hours later, the morning sun reflected off the pristine glass exterior of the First Heritage Private Depository in Buckhead. This was not a standard retail bank. There were no tellers standing behind bulletproof glass and no velvet ropes directing foot traffic. This institution catered exclusively to Atlanta's top-tier wealth. It was a fortress of marble and polished mahogany, where accounts required a minimum balance of $50 million just to secure an initial consultation. Sasha strutted through the heavy brass double doors like a conquering queen. She wore a tailored white sheath dress that screamed new money and carried a massive leather tote bag. Vivian flanked her on the right, wearing her signature judicial scowl and a string of pearls that cost more than most cars. Darnell walked on Sasha's left. He looked noticeably paler than he had the previous evening in my mother's house. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night spent frantically trying to access offshore accounts that I had already frozen. But despite his internal panic, Darnell forced his shoulders back, trying to project the image of a powerful corporate heavyweight taking control of a family tragedy. They approached the reception desk, where a young woman in a charcoal suit greeted them with a practiced, neutral smile. Sasha did not even bother returning the greeting. She simply slapped the forged blue-bound will onto the polished stone counter. "We are here to see Mr. Sterling," Sasha demanded. Her voice echoed sharply in the cavernous lobby. "Tell him the heirs to the Elijah Vance estate have arrived to process the immediate transfer of his trust accounts." The receptionist barely glanced at the document. She picked up a heavy desk phone, pressed a single button, and murmured a few inaudible words. Less than a minute later, the massive oak doors at the back of the lobby clicked open. Mr. Sterling emerged. He was a tall, slender man in his late 50s with silver hair and an impeccable British bespoke suit. He had managed the Aegis Nexus accounts for years. He knew exactly where every cent of that $300 million fortune came from. He also knew exactly who was pulling the strings. "Right this way, please," Mr. Sterling said, gesturing toward his private conference room. His tone was perfectly polite but entirely devoid of the groveling deference Vivian and Sasha clearly expected. The trio followed him into a sprawling room dominated by a custom-cut granite conference table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline. Sasha immediately took the seat at the head of the table. She pulled out the fraudulent will and slid it across the cold stone surface toward the banker. Vivian sat to her right, looking incredibly smug. Darnell remained standing near the window, crossing his arms in a weak attempt to look intimidating. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Sterling, Vivian ordered. Her voice carried the sharp, authoritative crack of a woman accustomed to banging a gavel. "You know why we are here. My brother passed away tragically. It is a devastating loss for our prominent family. However, we must ensure his legacy is protected. This document is his final legally binding will and testament. He drafted it just months before his death. It clearly stipulates that 50% of his entire estate, including all liquid assets and venture capital holdings, must be immediately transferred to a secure trust for his biological son, Trey. Sasha is the named executor of that trust." Sasha leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She gave Mr. Sterling a sweet, predatory smile. "I understand Elijah had a sizable portfolio," she said. "We are talking about the $300 million Aegis Nexus Fund. I want the transfer initiated today. I also want full access to his personal checking and savings accounts so I can begin making arrangements for my son's future." Darnell cleared his throat, trying to inject himself into the power dynamic. "Furthermore, we will need you to freeze any credit lines or secondary accounts currently accessible by his widow, Maya. She has demonstrated erratic and highly unstable behavior since the funeral. We have reason to believe she might attempt to misappropriate family funds before the probate court officially validates this will." Mr. Sterling did not touch the document. He did not even look at it. He stood perfectly still at the edge of the table, clasping his hands behind his back. He looked at Sasha, then at Vivian, and finally at Darnell. His expression was not one of compliance or intimidation. It was an expression of profound professional pity. "I am afraid there has been a significant misunderstanding," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was smooth and completely unflappable. Sasha frowned. Her perfectly manicured fingernails tapped impatiently against the granite table. "There is no misunderstanding. The will is right there. The DNA test proving paternity is attached. Elijah was the founder and principal owner of Aegis Nexus. I am the mother of his only heir. Process the transfer." Mr. Sterling offered a small, tight smile. "That is precisely the root of your misunderstanding, Dr. Vance. You see, I cannot transfer the Aegis Nexus trust accounts to you. I cannot transfer his personal savings to you. I cannot grant you access to the portfolio. And I certainly cannot freeze any accounts belonging to his widow." Vivian slammed her hand flat against the table. The sharp smack echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Listen to me very carefully, Sterling," she snapped. "I am a federal judge. I know the law. If you refuse to honor a legally binding document regarding my brother's estate, I will personally ensure this bank is tied up in so much litigation, you will be answering subpoenas until the day you retire. Do not play games with us. Who is stopping this transfer?" "I am sorry, Your Honor," Mr. Sterling replied, completely unbothered by her threat. "But you are operating under a fundamental misconception about your brother's financial standing. Mr. Elijah Vance was never the principal account holder of the Aegis Nexus Trust. He was merely a proxy, a signatory appointed to manage daily operations and serve as the public face of the firm. He possessed zero equity in the actual capital." The air in the room seemed to instantly evaporate. Sasha's mouth fell open in shock. Vivian stared at the banker as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Darnell gripped the windowsill, his knuckles turning stark white. "A proxy," Sasha repeated. Her voice was breathless and high-pitched. "What do you mean, a proxy?" "He was the founder. He was on the cover of Forbes. He was the CEO. Titles are often ceremonial, Dr. Vance," Mr. Sterling explained gently. "The capital that built Aegis Nexus, the initial seed money, and every subsequent round of funding originated from a single private principal investor. Elijah Vance was a highly paid employee of that principal. He received a generous salary and a modest operational budget. But he did not own the $300 million fortune. Therefore, he cannot bequeath it to your son or anyone else. His personal estate consists only of his savings from his salary, which amounts to roughly $400,000. A respectable sum, certainly, but far from the empire you are attempting to claim. Vivian stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a lie," she shouted. "My brother was a titan. He built that wealth. Who is this principal investor? Who is hiding behind his hard work? I demand to know who owns the Aegis Nexus Trust right now." Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors of the conference room swung open. The solid thud of the brass handles hitting the wall made all three of them jump. Sasha, Vivian, and Darnell spun around simultaneously. The smug entitlement evaporated from their faces, replaced instantly by utter confusion and growing dread. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the room. I was no longer the grieving widow hiding in the background. I was no longer the unpolished scapegoat they loved to mock. I was no longer wearing the simple black morning dress or the comfortable cardigans I usually wore to my thrift bookstore. I was wearing a pristine, razor-sharp, white-tailored Tom Ford suit that cost exactly $10,000. The cut was immaculate, clinging to my frame with lethal precision. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless style. I wore a pair of diamond stud earrings that caught the morning light filtering through the massive windows. My posture was straight, my chin held high, and my expression was absolute ice. I looked exactly like what I was, a billionaire stepping into her boardroom. Mr. Sterling immediately stepped back and offered a deep, respectful bow. "Good morning, Madam Principal," he said, his tone filled with genuine reverence. "I was just explaining the structural realities of the Aegis Nexus Fund to your guests." "Thank you, Sterling," I said. My voice was calm, projecting absolute authority. "You explained it perfectly." Vivian stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the granite table. She looked at my suit, then at Sterling, then back at me. Her mind was frantically trying to process a reality that completely shattered her entire worldview. Darnell looked physically ill. He recognized the look in my eyes. It was the same look I gave him last night when I trapped his stolen funds. Sasha gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white, her chest heaving. "No," she gasped. Her voice trembled with panic and denial. "No, this is impossible. You run a dusty thrift store. You dropped out of college. You are nothing." Elijah was the genius. Elijah had the pedigree. I walked slowly toward the head of the table. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor. Each step sounded like the ticking of a bomb they could not defuse. I stopped right in front of Sasha, forcing her to look up at me. I looked down at the forged will lying on the table. I reached out and casually pushed it off the edge. The blue-bound document fluttered uselessly to the floor, landing by my $10,000 shoes. I locked eyes with my former best friend. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. "Did you really think a black man in his 30s built a $300 million venture capital firm without a silent partner?" I asked. My voice was a soft, lethal whisper that cut through the silence of the vault. "I built the algorithm. I secured the seed money. I bought the assets. Elijah was my employee." The heavy silence in the vault was absolute. Sasha backed away from me as if I had caught fire. Her mouth opened and closed silently. Vivian gripped the edge of the granite table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Darnell looked like he might vomit on the polished floor. I turned and walked out, leaving them suffocating in reality. I knew they would not go down quietly. Elitists like Vivian and social climbers like Sasha never retreated. When they lost, they resorted to the only weapon they knew how to use, which was public perception. The next morning, my phone was vibrating off the nightstand. Sasha and Vivian had worked through the night launching a smear campaign across every major black media outlet and gossip blog in Atlanta. They leveraged Vivian's political connections and Sasha's sorority image to feed anonymous tips to hungry reporters. The headlines were vicious and fabricated. They framed me as a manipulative gold digger who had emotionally abused Elijah for years. One blog published an interview with an unnamed family source claiming I had driven my husband to an early grave through my relentless financial demands. They painted a picture of a brilliant man trapped in a miserable marriage with an unstable woman who forced him to work himself to death. Sasha leaked photos of herself crying at the funeral, contrasting them with images of me looking stoic, framing my quiet grief as cold indifference. I ignored the buzzing phone and drove down to my thrift bookstore. The shop was located in a gentrifying historic district of downtown Atlanta. When I pulled up to the curb, I saw the immediate results of Vivian and Sasha's handiwork. A crowd of 20 people had gathered on the sidewalk blocking the entrance to my shop. They were shouting insults, calling me a fraud, a gold digger, and a disgrace to Elijah's memory. The community had idolized my husband as a beacon of black excellence. Now they believed I was the villain who destroyed him. I parked my car in the alley and let myself in through the heavy steel service door. I walked through the back room and stepped into the main storefront. The noise from the protesters was muffled by the thick glass, but I could clearly see their angry faces pressed against the windows. I walked behind the vintage wooden counter, picked up my barcode scanner, and began processing a stack of newly donated paperback novels. The repetitive beep of the scanner was soothing. I did not engage with the crowd outside. I simply did my job. 30 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb, scattering the protesters. Darnell stepped out of the back seat. He looked entirely different from the terrified man in the bank vault yesterday. He looked arrogant, puffed up with false confidence. The little bell chimed as Darnell pushed his way inside. He strutted toward the counter, treating my store like a disease he was forced to step in. "You are remarkably calm for a woman whose entire life is going up in flames," Maya Darnell sneered. He looked around the shop with absolute disgust. "I suppose you are too ignorant to understand the gravity of your situation. Vivian and Sasha have destroyed you in the press. By tomorrow morning you will be a pariah." I scanned a worn copy of a romance novel and placed it in the inventory bin. Beep! The sound echoed sharply in the quiet store. I did not look up at him. "Are you here to buy a book, Darnell?" I asked calmly. "Because if you are just here to deliver a dramatic monologue, you are blocking the natural light." Darnell slammed a thick manila envelope onto the counter directly over the books I was scanning. "I am here to deliver a reality check," he said. "You played a good game at the bank yesterday. You almost had me fooled with your suit. But Vivian reminded me of who you really are. You are a dropout. You are a nobody. You probably hacked Elijah's accounts to make it look like you own the firm, but we will expose you." I picked up the envelope and slid the single sheet of paper out. It was a formal eviction and foreclosure notice. It stated that the building housing my bookstore was slated for immediate demolition. Darnell leaned on the counter, invading my personal space. "Read it carefully and weep, Maya. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate these premises. My commercial real estate firm just bought this entire city block. We are tearing down this pathetic shop to build a luxury high-rise. We are erasing your little front operation. You thought you could outsmart us, but you forgot that we own this city." I placed the eviction notice neatly on the counter. I looked at Darnell. I saw the same smug, entitled boy he had been a decade ago. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I picked up my scanner again. Beep. "You always did have a terrible memory, Darnell," I said quietly. I kept scanning the books. My movements were slow and deliberate. You rely so heavily on your expensive suits and your country club memberships that you forget how you actually got them. "Do you remember 10 years ago, Darnell? Do you remember when Elijah first introduced me to the family?" Darnell rolled his eyes. "I remember you embarrassing us at dinner with your cheap clothes and your ghetto attitude." "I remember it differently," I replied. "I remember a desperate associate at a mediocre real estate firm practically begging his brother-in-law for an investment. I remember you complaining that you could not secure funding for your commercial development project because you lacked a unique logistical angle. And I remember sitting at that dinner table and handing you a complete data modeling algorithm that mapped out predictive gentrification patterns." Darnell's smug expression faltered. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "You took my research, Darnell," I continued. My voice was a low, steady hum. "You took my algorithm and presented it to your board of directors as your own brilliant idea. When Elijah confronted you about it, you laughed. You told him that a black woman who dropped out of Spelman was too unpolished to ever pitch a multi-million-dollar algorithm to a board of wealthy white male investors. You said you were doing me a favor by putting a respectable face on my ghetto ideas. You built your entire career off my unpolished brain. That is ancient history, Maya Darnell snapped. He stood up straight, trying to physically tower over me. It does not change the fact that I own this building now. I control your future. You have 24 hours to get out. I set the barcode scanner down. I opened the bottom drawer of the counter and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. I placed it gently on top of his ridiculous eviction notice. The problem with relying on other people to build your foundation, Darnell, is that you never know when they are going to pull the bricks out from under you, I said. I tapped the black folder with my index finger. Open it. Darnell looked at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He hesitated, his false confidence completely evaporating. Slowly, he reached out and opened the cover. He stared at the documents inside. His eyes scanned the heavy legal text and the brightly colored corporate seals. I watched the blood drain from his face until he looked like a corpse. His mouth fell open and he let out a choked, gasping sound. What is this?" he stammered. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. "This is impossible." I leaned across the counter, resting my elbows on the polished wood. I looked him dead in the eyes. I let the full weight of my actual power crash down on him. "Your firm did not buy this block, Darnell," I said softly. My voice was completely devoid of mercy. "My shell company bought your firm an hour ago. I acquired a hostile controlling stake in your entire real estate portfolio before you even finished your morning coffee. Your board of directors was more than happy to sell you out for double market value." Darnell stumbled backward. He knocked over a display stand of vintage magazines. The paperbacks tumbled to the floor in a messy heap. He looked completely shattered. "You do not own this building," I continued. "You do not own the luxury high-rise project. You do not even own the company car you drove here in. I own everything you have ever touched." I reached out and slowly pushed his eviction notice off the counter, letting it flutter to the floor. I smiled a cold, brilliant smile. "Your firm did not buy this block, Darnell. I did. You are fired. Now get out of my store." Darnell scrambled out of my own bookstore. 3 days later, the heavy doors of the Fulton County Probate Court swung shut behind me. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish. I walked down the center aisle wearing a charcoal gray suit. My lawyer, Arthur Vance, walked beside me carrying a single slim briefcase. We took our seats at the respondent's table. We were not carrying boxes of fabricated evidence. We only needed the absolute truth. Across the aisle, Sasha sat with her shoulders hunched forward, playing the role of the fragile, grieving mother to absolute perfection. She wore a modest navy dress, completely at odds with her usual flashy wardrobe. Vivian sat directly behind her, in the gallery, radiating an aura of untouchable authority. Next to Vivian sat my mother. Clarice Vance wore a conservative pearl necklace and stared rigidly at the judge's bench, actively avoiding my gaze. Darnell was conspicuously absent, presumably still trying to salvage the wreckage of his seized firm. Judge Harrison called the court to order. This was an expedited hearing granted entirely due to Vivian's backdoor political maneuvering. They wanted to validate the forged will quickly before my asset freeze starved them out. Sasha's lawyer, a theatrical man with a booming voice, called his first witness. Sasha walked to the stand with slow steps. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down clutching a lace handkerchief. "Please tell the court the nature of your relationship with the deceased, Elijah Vance," her lawyer prompted. Sasha dabbed her eyes. "Elijah and I were deeply in love," she whispered. "We tried to fight it. We really did. But Maya was cold to him. She neglected her duties as a wife. Elijah felt trapped. He came to me for comfort, and that comfort turned into a profound connection. We conceived our son Lucas during a private romantic getaway." Her lawyer approached the bench holding the forged document. "And did Mr. Vance make provisions for this child?" "Yes," Sasha sobbed, wiping away a single tear. "He knew Maya would be vindictive if she found out. He wanted to make sure our boy was protected. He drafted a new will naming me as the executor of a trust for Lucas, ensuring he would receive his rightful half of the estate. He also gave me the results of a private DNA test he commissioned proving paternity." The lawyers submitted the forged will and the fabricated DNA results into evidence. Sasha spent 20 minutes painting a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She described fictitious late-night conversations where Elijah wept in her arms over my cruelty. She framed me as a ruthless social climber. The gallery murmured in sympathy. Judge Harrison looked over his spectacles, his expression softening with pity. I sat perfectly still, writing a single note on my legal pad and sliding it over to Arthur. The note read, "Let her dig the hole deeper." Arthur nodded. He understood the strategy. When Sasha stepped down, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted entirely in their favor. Vivian offered Sasha a comforting squeeze on the shoulder. Then the opposing counsel called their star witness, Clarice Vance. My mother smoothed her expensive skirt and walked to the stand, projecting the image of a respectable grieving mother-in-law. She took the oath and sat down. Mrs. Vance, the lawyer, began gently. You are the mother of the respondent, Maya Vance. This must be incredibly difficult for you. Clarice let out a shaky, theatrical sigh. It is the hardest thing I have ever had to do, she said. But I must honor Elijah's memory. He was like a son to me, and he deserves the truth. Can you tell the court about the state of your daughter's marriage to Elijah? Clarice finally looked at me. Her eyes were cold. She was sacrificing her own flesh and blood to maintain her status in Vivian's elite social circle. My daughter was never suited for a man of Elijah's caliber, Clarice stated firmly. She was erratic. She lacked grace. Elijah confided in me often. He told me how deeply unhappy he was. He felt completely suffocated by Maya's endless hostility. And did he ever mention Sasha to you? The lawyer asked. Yes, Clarice said, nodding sadly. He told me he had finally found peace with Sasha. He told me about their son, Lucas. He begged me to help him navigate a divorce, but he was terrified of how Maya would react. He drafted that new will to protect his true legacy. I am here today because I cannot let my daughter's greed destroy the innocent child Elijah loved so much. The courtroom was dead silent. A mother testifying against her own daughter to validate a fabricated affair was the ultimate trump card. Vivian smirked at me from the gallery, her eyes gleaming with wicked triumph. Sasha hid her face behind her handkerchief, pretending to cry, while actually hiding a victorious, arrogant smile. They thought they had won. They thought the unpolished thrift store owner was finally crushed under the weight of their coordinated lies. Judge Harrison turned to my table. Does the defense wish to cross-examine the witnesses, he asked. His tone suggested he thought it would be a complete waste of time. Arthur stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. Yes, Your Honor, we have a few simple clarifying questions for Dr. Sasha Vance. Sasha sighed, dramatically rising from her chair and returning to the stand. She looked at Arthur with bored condescension, fully confident that her flawless performance had rendered her legally untouchable. Dr. Vance Arthur began pacing slowly toward the center of the room. You have presented a very compelling narrative today. You submitted a DNA test and a will, both supposedly proving that the late Elijah Vance is the biological father of your child. That is correct, Sasha said, lifting her chin. The documents speak for themselves. They certainly do, Arthur replied smoothly. But I want to focus on the exact timeline. You testified that Elijah felt trapped in his marriage and sought comfort in your arms. You claim this child was conceived during a private getaway. Is that correct? Yes, Sasha answered firmly. Arthur stopped pacing. For the official record, Dr. Vance, and understanding that perjury is a severe criminal offense, could you confirm the exact date of this private getaway? When exactly was this child conceived? Sasha's lawyer stood up, half out of his chair. Objection. Your Honor. Relevance. The DNA test confirms paternity. The exact date is an unnecessary invasion of privacy. Overruled, Judge Harrison said, leaning forward. The respondent has the right to establish the timeline of the alleged affair. Please answer the question, Dr. Vance. Sasha glared at Arthur, but she did not panic. She had clearly memorized her fabricated timeline to match Lucas's birth certificate. It was the second weekend of October, she stated arrogantly. Elijah told Maya he had a tech conference in Seattle. Instead, he flew me down to a private luxury villa in Cabo San Lucas. We spent 3 gorgeous days together away from Maya's toxicity. That was the weekend Lucas was conceived, October 12th through the 14th. I will never forget it. You are absolutely certain of those dates? Arthur asked. October 12th through the 14th, in Cabo San Lucas. I am positive, Sasha sneered. Her confidence was absolute. She thought she had me cornered. She thought her meticulously crafted lie was entirely bulletproof. Arthur walked back to our table. He picked up a thick manila folder adorned with several bright red international customs stamps and heavy wax seals. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice ringing out clearly across the silent courtroom. "We would like to submit Defense Exhibit A into evidence." He walked to the bench and handed the heavy folder to the judge. Sasha frowned, her arrogant facade slipping just a fraction of an inch. Vivian sat up straight in the gallery, her political instincts suddenly screaming that something was terribly wrong. Clarice looked back and forth between me and Arthur, genuine confusion masking her perfectly staged grief. "What is this?" Judge Harrison asked, opening the folder and reviewing the heavily stamped documents inside. Arthur turned to look directly at Sasha. He smiled. It was the same cold, terrifying smile I had given Darnell in my bookstore. "Your Honor, that is a verified, authenticated medical file from the Herslanden Clinic in Zurich, Switzerland," Arthur announced. "It contains flight logs, hospital admission records, surgical notes, and sworn affidavits from 3 attending physicians." Sasha's face drained of all color. Her hands gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. "That is fascinating, Dr. Vance," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp register. "Because on that exact weekend, October 12th through the 14th, while you claim you were conceiving a child in Cabo San Lucas, Elijah Vance was in a hospital in Switzerland having emergency surgery." The heavy silence in the courtroom shattered instantly. Vivian leaped from her seat in the gallery, her judicial composure entirely forgotten. She pointed a trembling finger at the manila folder resting on the judge's bench. "Those documents mean absolutely nothing," Vivian screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Anyone with enough money can fabricate a medical file." She hired some foreign doctor to print out fake flight logs and surgical notes. "You cannot possibly accept that as evidence over a legitimate DNA test." "My brother was in Cabo. He was with Sasha. This is just another pathetic, desperate trick." Judge Harrison banged his gavel sharply against the sounding block, demanding immediate order. He glared down at Vivian with stern, reprimanding eyes. "You will control yourself, Judge Vivian, or I will have the bailiff remove you from my courtroom," he warned. "This is a court of law, not a street corner. I will remind you that you are a spectator here today." The judge adjusted his glasses and opened the heavy file again. "These documents are accompanied by a sworn affidavit from the Swiss consulate. If you are accusing the defense of fabricating international records, you need proof immediately now." Sasha was gripping the edges of the witness stand so tightly that her knuckles were completely white. Her confident posture had completely dissolved into a defensive crouch. She looked frantically toward Vivian for guidance, but the judge had effectively silenced her strongest ally. She turned her panicked eyes back to Arthur. "He could not have been in Switzerland," Sasha stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I know he was with me. I remember the weekend perfectly. We drank tequila on the balcony. He bought me a necklace. The DNA test proves that he is the biological father of my child today." Arthur simply smiled and stepped back from the podium. He gestured toward me with a graceful sweep of his hand. I stood up from the respondent's table. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal gray suit and walked slowly toward the center of the room. The entire gallery watched me in breathless silence. Clarice stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, suddenly realizing that her perjury was about to trap her in a cage of her own making. I did not look at my mother. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the trembling woman in the witness stand now. "You always were a terrible liar, Sasha," I said softly. My voice carried clearly across the quiet courtroom. "You rehearse your lines perfectly, but you never bother to research the underlying facts." Elijah did not buy you a necklace in Cabo San Lucas on October 14th. On October 14th, Elijah was lying in a sterile recovery room in Zurich. He was recovering from a highly specialized vascular procedure. Arthur just handed the judge the entire unredacted medical history. But there is a second part to that file, Sasha. A part that completely destroys your pathetic fabricated DNA test once completely. Sasha shrank back in the wooden chair. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, shooting another desperate glance toward the gallery. Vivian was rigidly still, her face a mask of furious concentration. I took one step closer to the witness stand. Elijah did not just have surgery that weekend. Sasha, I explained. He was dealing with severe complications from a serious illness he contracted in his late 20s. The illness nearly killed him. He survived, but it caused irreversible damage to his reproductive system. My husband, Elijah Vance, was 100% sterile permanently. A loud gasp rippled through the courtroom gallery. Several reporters in the back row began typing frantically on their phones. I kept my eyes locked on Sasha, watching her entire world collapse. I raised my voice so everyone could hear the undeniable truth. "He was completely sterile, Sasha," I repeated. "He had a medically documented, irreversible vasectomy 3 years before you claim he got you pregnant in Cabo. The surgical notes are in that file. The post-operative fertility tests are in that file. It is biologically impossible for Elijah Vance to be the father of your son Lucas now." Sasha turned the color of ash. Her perfectly styled hair suddenly looked messy and out of place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked down at her hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the truth. The fake DNA test she had brought to court was instantly proven to be a fraudulent document. The carefully constructed lie she had built to steal my home and my assets was destroyed in a matter of minutes. She had walked into the courtroom playing the victim, but she was leaving as a confirmed criminal right here. Clarice covered her face with both hands, softly crying into her palms. She had sworn under oath that Elijah confided in her about his secret love for Sasha and their biological son. Now she was completely exposed as a liar and a perjurer. She had sold out her own daughter for a chance to remain in high society, and she had lost absolutely everything. Judge Harrison flipped through the final pages of the medical file verifying my claims. He looked down at Sasha with an expression of absolute disgust. He closed the heavy manila folder and folded his hands tightly. "Dr. Vance, Judge Harrison," said his voice dropping to a low, rumbling growl, "you have presented a fraudulent DNA test to this court. You have submitted a forged will. You have lied under oath regarding the paternity of your child. I do not think you fully understand the gravity of your current situation. You are sitting in a federal probate hearing, attempting to misappropriate millions of dollars using fabricated evidence. That constitutes federal perjury and felony fraud. I am ordering the bailiff to take you into immediate custody. You will be held without bail pending a full criminal investigation today." Sasha let out a sharp, terrified scream. "No," she wailed, tears streaming down her ruined face. "Please, Your Honor. I was desperate. I did not know what else to do. Tyler left me with nothing. I just wanted to secure a future for my baby. It was not my idea. Please do not send me to jail." The bailiff stepped forward, grabbing Sasha by the arm and pulling her out of the witness chair. She sobbed hysterically as he escorted her out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her, leaving a completely stunned silence behind her. Vivian jumped to her feet again. She could not accept defeat. She was a woman who had spent her entire life bending the world to her will, and she was not about to let a thrift store owner walk away with the Aegis Nexus fortune. Her eyes burned with a manic, desperate energy. Fine Vivian shouted, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "If the child is not his, then the forged will is completely void. But that does not change the core financial reality of my brother's estate. The $300 million still belongs to his bloodline, absolutely." She stormed down the center aisle, stopping right behind the respondent's table. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You heard the banker yesterday," Vivian yelled, addressing the judge but staring at me. Elijah was just a proxy. He was managing the funds for a silent principal investor. But he was legally married to this woman. Any assets he acquired during their marriage are subject to family reclamation. The money belongs to his true bloodline, and that means me. I am his sister. I am the rightful heir to the Vance family legacy. Maya gets absolutely nothing today. She glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion. "You are just the proxy's widow," she spat. "You are a placeholder. You manipulated your way into his life, but you cannot legally claim the Aegis Nexus fortune. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. I will freeze every single account. I will make sure you never see a dime of that money. You thought you outsmarted us by proving Sasha is a liar, but you just handed the entire estate directly to me. I am the final beneficiary of my brother's incredibly hard work now." I looked at Vivian with genuine amusement. She was so blinded by her own greed and elitism that she could not see the massive trap she had just walked right into. I slowly shook my head, letting a quiet, confident laugh escape my lips. I picked up my briefcase and snapped it shut. I stood up and walked directly over to her. The entire courtroom was watching us. "You are so absolutely desperate to claim his supposed fortune that you forgot to ask who the silent principal investor was all this time. You still do not get it, do you?" The game had officially changed and I was holding all the pieces. Less than 12 hours later, the morning sun reflected off the pristine glass exterior of the First Heritage Private Depository in Buckhead. This was not a standard retail bank. There were no tellers standing behind bulletproof glass, and no velvet ropes directing foot traffic. This institution catered exclusively to Atlanta's top-tier wealth. It was a fortress of marble and polished mahogany, where accounts required a minimum balance of $50 million just to secure an initial consultation. Sasha strutted through the heavy brass double doors, perfectly confident. She wore a tailored white sheath dress that screamed new money and carried a massive leather tote bag. Vivian flanked her on the right, wearing her signature judicial scowl and a string of pearls that cost more than most cars. Darnell walked on Sasha's left. He looked noticeably paler than he had the previous evening in my mother's house. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night spent frantically trying to access the foreign accounts that I had already frozen. But despite his internal panic, Darnell forced his shoulders back, trying to project the image of absolute power. He wanted to look like a corporate heavyweight taking control of a family tragedy. They approached the reception desk where a young woman in a charcoal suit greeted them with a practiced, neutral smile. Sasha did not even bother returning the polite greeting. She simply slapped the forged blue leather will onto the polished stone counter. "We are here to see Mr. Sterling," Sasha demanded. Her voice echoed sharply in the cavernous lobby. "Tell him the heirs to the Elijah Vance estate have arrived to process the immediate transfer of his trust accounts." The receptionist barely glanced at the document. She picked up a heavy desk phone, pressed a single button, and murmured a few inaudible words. Less than a minute later, the massive oak doors at the back of the lobby clicked open. Mr. Sterling emerged. He was a tall, slender man in his late 50s, with silver hair and an impeccable British bespoke suit. He had managed the Aegis Nexus accounts for years. He knew exactly where every cent of that $300 million fortune came from. He also knew exactly who was pulling the strings. "Right this way, please," Mr. Sterling said, gesturing toward his private conference room. His tone was perfectly polite, but entirely devoid of the groveling deference Vivian and Sasha clearly expected. The trio followed him into a sprawling room dominated by a custom stone granite conference table. Tall glass window panels offered a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline. Sasha immediately took the seat at the head of the table. She pulled out the fraudulent will and slid it across the cold stone surface toward the banker. Vivian sat to her right, looking incredibly smug. Darnell remained standing near the window, crossing his arms in a weak attempt to look extremely intimidating. Let us skip the pleasantries, Sterling, Vivian ordered. Her voice carried the sharp, authoritative crack of a woman accustomed to banging a gavel. You know why we are here. My brother passed away tragically. It is a devastating loss for our prominent family. However, we must ensure his legacy is protected. This document is his final legally binding will and testament. He drafted it just months before his death. It clearly stipulates that 50% of his entire estate, including all liquid assets and venture capital holdings, must be immediately transferred to a secure trust for his biological son, Trey. Sasha is the named executor of that trust. Sasha leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She gave Mr. Sterling a sweet, predatory smile. I understand Elijah had a sizable portfolio, she said. We are talking about the $300 million Aegis Nexus Fund. I want the transfer initiated today. I also want full access to his personal checking and savings accounts, so I can begin making arrangements for my son's future. Darnell cleared his throat, trying to inject himself into the power dynamic. Furthermore, we will need you to freeze any credit lines or secondary accounts immediately. These accounts are currently accessible by his widow Maya. She has demonstrated erratic and highly unstable behavior since the funeral. We have reason to believe she might attempt to misappropriate family funds before the probate court officially validates this will. Mr. Sterling did not touch the document. He did not even look at it. He stood perfectly still at the edge of the table, clasping his hands behind his back. He looked at Sasha, then at Vivian, and finally at Darnell. His expression was not one of compliance or intimidation. It was an expression of profound professional pity and grace. I am afraid there has been a significant misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling said. His voice was smooth and completely unflappable. Sasha frowned. Her perfectly manicured fingernails tapped impatiently against the granite table. There is no misunderstanding. The will is right there. The DNA test proving paternity is attached. Elijah was the founder and principal owner of Aegis Nexus. I am the mother of his only heir. Process the transfer. Mr. Sterling offered a small, tight smile. That is precisely the root of your misunderstanding, Dr. Vance. You see, I cannot transfer the Aegis Nexus trust accounts to you under any circumstance. I cannot transfer his personal savings to you. I cannot grant you access to the portfolio, and I certainly cannot freeze any accounts belonging to his widow. Vivian slammed her hand flat against the table. The sharp smack echoed loudly in the quiet room. Listen to me very carefully, Sterling, she snapped. I am a federal judge. I know the law. If you refuse to honor a legally binding document regarding my brother's estate, I will personally ensure this bank is tied up in so much litigation you will be answering subpoenas until the day you retire. Do not play games with us. Who is stopping this transfer? I am sorry, Your Honor, Mr. Sterling replied, completely unbothered by her threat. But you are operating under a fundamental misconception about your brother's financial standing. Mr. Elijah Vance was never the principal account holder of the Aegis Nexus Trust. He was merely a proxy, a signatory appointed to manage daily operations and serve as the public face of the firm. He possessed zero equity in the actual capital. The air in the room seemed to instantly evaporate. Sasha's mouth fell open in shock. Vivian stared at the banker, completely, utterly stunned. She looked as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Darnell gripped the windowsill, his knuckles turning stark white. A proxy, Sasha repeated. Her voice was breathless and high-pitched. What do you mean, a proxy? He was the founder. He was on the cover of Forbes. He was the CEO. Titles are often ceremonial. Dr. Vance, Mr. Sterling explained gently. The capital that built Aegis Nexus, the initial seed money, and every subsequent round of funding originated from a single private principal investor. Elijah Vance was a highly paid employee of that principal. He received money. He received a generous salary and a modest operational budget. But he did not own the $300 million fortune. Therefore, he cannot bequeath it to your son or anyone else. His personal estate consists only of his savings from his salary, which amounts to roughly $400,000. A respectable sum, certainly, but far from the empire you are attempting to claim. Vivian stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. This is a lie, she shouted. My brother was a titan. He built that wealth. Who is this principal investor? Who is hiding right now? Who is hiding behind his hard work? I demand to know who owns the Aegis Nexus Trust right now. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors of the conference room swung open. The solid thud of the brass handles hitting the wall made all three of them jump. Sasha, Vivian, and Darnell spun around simultaneously. The smug entitlement evaporated from their faces, replaced instantly by utter confusion and growing dread. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the room. I was no longer the grieving widow hiding in the background. I was no longer the unpolished scapegoat they mocked. I was no longer wearing the simple black morning dress or the comfortable cardigans I usually wore to my thrift bookstore. I was wearing a pristine, razor-sharp, white-tailored Tom Ford suit that cost exactly $10,000. The cut was immaculate, clinging to my frame with lethal precision. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless style. My expression was absolute ice. I looked right at Sasha and said to her face, "Did you really think a black man in his 30s built a $300 million venture capital firm without a silent partner? Elijah was my employee." The silence in the conference room was absolute. Vivian backed away from the table as if the polished granite had suddenly caught fire. Her mouth opened and closed silently, but no sound came out. Sasha stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She looked like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had just been locked. Darnell pressed himself flat against the glass window, attempting to merge with the surrounding architecture. I walked slowly around the heavy stone table, letting the immaculate cut of my white suit command the entire room. I looked directly into Vivian's panicked eyes. "You spent the last decade calling me Ghetto Vivian," I said very smoothly. "You mocked my background. You ridiculed my Spelman dropout status. You told everyone in your elite circle that I was a gold digger clinging to your brilliant brother. But you never bothered to ask why a brilliant venture capitalist needed me around." Elijah did not build Aegis Nexus. He did not code the predictive gentrification algorithm that made the firm its first $50 million. I did. Vivian stumbled backward, knocking her expensive leather handbag onto the floor. I watched her perfectly constructed reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. Elite investors would never hand millions of dollars to an unpolished black woman without a college degree. I continued, my voice echoing sharply. They wanted a pedigree. They wanted a legacy. They wanted an aggressive, confident black man who played golf and spoke the language of the country club. So I married your brother and made him the face of my company. He pitched my algorithms. He closed my deals. I paid him a massive salary to play the role of the visionary founder, while I sat in the background and pulled every string. "You funded my entire life," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with sudden, horrifying realization. I smiled a cold, brilliant smile. "Every single dime," I confirmed. "Your country club membership fees were paid from my dividends. The mortgage on your luxury estate was secured using my corporate assets as collateral. Even the expensive shoes you are wearing right now were bought entirely with my money. You have spent 10 years looking down on the exact woman who was secretly paying for your entire existence." Darnell let out a choked, gasping sound. He had heard enough. He knew his own fraudulent empire had already been seized by my shell companies, and now he realized the full extent of my actual power. He turned away from the window and began inching toward the heavy mahogany doors. His eyes darted nervously around the room, looking for an escape route. He reached out and grabbed the cold brass door handle. "Leaving so soon, Darnell?" I asked loudly, my voice cutting through the thick tension like a whip. "We have not even discussed whose baby Trey really is." Darnell froze completely. He slowly turned back around, his face dripping with cold sweat. Sasha let out a sharp, terrified shriek. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the fabricated DNA test off the granite table, but Mr. Sterling swiftly pulled the document out of her reach. Sasha covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically. Vivian turned her head slowly, looking back and forth between Sasha and Darnell. What are you talking about, Maya? Vivian demanded, her judicial authority completely evaporating into raw panic. What does Darnell have to do with Sasha's baby? I turned my attention back to the weeping woman at the table. Sasha brought a DNA test to court, claiming it proved Elijah was the father of her child, I explained, projecting my voice so every single spoken word landed with maximum impact. But as we all know, Elijah was completely sterile. He had a medically documented irreversible vasectomy 3 years before Sasha got pregnant. That meant her DNA test was either entirely fabricated or it was incredibly revealing. I walked up to Sasha and slammed both of my hands down on the table right in front of her. She flinched violently. You wanted a piece of the Vance family inheritance so badly, Sasha, that you decided to play a very dangerous game, I said softly. You knew Elijah was wealthy, but he rejected your advances. So you looked for the next best thing. You looked for another man with the Vance family connections. Another man who could give you a child with the right genetic markers to pass a superficial familial DNA test if the probate courts ever demanded to see one. Sasha was shaking uncontrollably. Please stop, she begged, weeping openly. Please, Maya, do not do this. I ignored her entirely. I stood up straight and looked directly at Vivian. I took the liberty of running a cross-reference on the raw data from the DNA test Sasha submitted. I stated clearly. I compared the genetic markers to the extended family database. I wanted to see exactly how she managed to fake a positive result. It turns out she did not fake the raw data. She had just lied about which family member the DNA belonged to. Vivian's face drained of all color. She looked at Darnell, who was now physically trembling against the heavy wooden doors. You wanted a piece of the inheritance so badly, Sasha, that you slept with Vivian's husband, I announced, letting the absolute truth detonate in the middle of the room. Trey is Darnell's son. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Vivian stared at her husband. Darnell could not meet her eyes. He looked down at the floor, completely defeated. He had betrayed his powerful wife with a desperate social climber, and now his darkest secret was completely exposed in front of the bank manager and the very woman he had tried to destroy. You slept with him, Vivian whispered, her voice shaking with an unnatural, terrifying calm. You slept with my husband in my house. Sasha sobbed loudly, pressing her face against the polished stone table. He told me he was going to leave you, Sasha wailed defensively. He told me you were cold and controlling. He promised we would take his share of the firm and start a new life. But then he lost all his money. He lost his company. I had to secure a future for my baby. I had to use Elijah's name because Darnell was suddenly completely worthless. Vivian snapped. The flawless facade of the perfect elite black family was entirely shattered. Decades of carefully cultivated respectability and high society poise evaporated in a single blinding flash of pure rage. Vivian let out a guttural, furious scream that echoed off the glass walls. She lunged across the room, throwing herself directly at Darnell. She slammed her fists into his chest, driving him hard against the mahogany doors. You pathetic, worthless coward, Vivian screamed, hitting him again and again. I gave you everything. I elevated you. I brought you into my family, and you betrayed me with this cheap, desperate fraud. You ruined my life. You destroyed my reputation. Darnell raised his arms, trying to shield his face from her relentless blows. Vivian, please, he begged, stepping backward and knocking over a heavy brass floor lamp. It was a mistake. She meant nothing to me. Vivian grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive suit and shoved him violently against the wall. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the air as Darnell's jacket gave way. Mr. Sterling rushed forward, attempting to separate them, but Vivian was operating on pure adrenaline and absolute devastation. She slapped Darnell across the face with tremendous force, leaving a bright red mark across his cheek. The elite judge, the untouchable matriarch, was physically brawling with her cheating husband in the middle of a highly private banking depository. I stood perfectly still, watching the empire they had built on my back burn to the ground. They had spent years trying to break me. They had coordinated a massive smear campaign. They had evicted me from my beloved bookstore. They had brought my own mother into a courtroom to commit perjury and completely destroy my good name in front of the entire world. Now they were destroying each other right before my eyes. The poetic justice of this moment was incredibly sweet and profoundly satisfying to witness. In the midst of the incredibly violent and chaotic struggle, the heavy mahogany doors were suddenly pushed wide open from the outside. The terrified receptionists had clearly heard the loud screaming and called for assistance. Two large armed security guards rushed into the conference room. They grabbed Vivian by the arms, pulling her away from her battered, bleeding husband. Vivian thrashed against their tight grip, screaming vile obscenities at Darnell while Sasha continued to sob hysterically at the table. In the chaos, Clarice crawled back to me, crying, "Maya, baby, I did not know they tricked me." I looked at my mother with eyes like ice. "Sit down, Clarice. I am not done with you yet." Vivian froze. Her manicured hand hovered in the air, pointing directly at my face. She breathed heavily, her chest rising and falling, as the echo of her furious screaming faded into the heavy silence of the courtroom. The judge, the bailiff, the gallery, and the opposing counsel all watched us with absolute breathless anticipation. Sasha remained slumped over the witness stand, sobbing quietly into her hands, as the reality of her impending federal perjury charges crushed her. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. I reached into my slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound stack of documents. They were not glossy marketing brochures or fabricated wills. They were the original deeply guarded incorporation papers for Aegis Nexus, the $300 million venture capital firm that Vivian was currently trying to steal. I dropped the heavy stack of documents onto the respondent's table. The loud thud echoed like a gunshot. I opened the cover page, revealing the brightly colored state seals and the ironclad legal signatures. I turned the documents so Vivian could see them clearly. "Elijah did not build Aegis Nexus, Vivian." I said, my voice completely calm and perfectly steady. "He did not code the predictive gentrification algorithm that generated the firm's first $50 million. He did not map the urban renewal pathways. I did. I am the silent principal investor. I am the sole proprietor. I own 100% of the equity." Vivian stared at the documents. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted back and forth across the legal text, trying desperately to find a loophole, to find a mistake, to find anything that would validate her shattered reality. "You spent the last decade calling me Ghetto Vivian." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You mocked my background. You ridiculed me at your dinner parties. You told everyone in your elite high society circle that I was just a pathetic, uneducated Spelman dropout clinging to your brilliant, sophisticated brother. But you never bothered to ask yourself why a brilliant venture capitalist needed me around." Vivian stumbled backward, slightly bumping into the wooden railing separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. "That is impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You dropped out. You were failing." "I never dropped out because I was failing, Vivian," I corrected sharply, letting the absolute truth ring out across the room. "I dropped out because I had already coded a revolutionary algorithm. I possessed a piece of software that was guaranteed to disrupt the entire commercial real estate market. I knew exactly how much it was worth. But I also knew the harsh, unforgiving reality of the financial world. Elite corporate investors would never hand millions of dollars to an unpolished young black woman without a college degree. They wanted a pedigree. They wanted a specific image. They wanted an aggressive, confident man who played golf and spoke the language of the country club. I looked down at the incorporation papers and then back up at Vivian. "So, I married your brother. He was an HBCU legacy with the right pedigree and the perfect smile. I hired him to act as the public face of my company. He pitched my algorithms. He closed my deals. I paid him a massive, generous salary to play the role of the visionary founder while I sat in the background and pulled every single string. I made the millions. I own everything." Vivian gripped the wooden railing. Her entire upper-class lifestyle flashed before her eyes. The realization hit her with the brutal force of a physical blow. "You funded my life!" Vivian gasped, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. I smiled a cold, merciless smile. "Every single dime," I confirmed. "Your prestigious country club membership fees were paid directly from my corporate dividends. The mortgage on your luxury estate was secured using my business assets as collateral. Even your husband's bloated salary at his mediocre real estate firm was secretly subsidized by my holding companies. You have spent 10 years looking down your nose at the exact woman who was quietly paying for your entire existence. You are nothing without me, Vivian. You are entirely fabricated. Vivian let out a choked, humiliating sob. The untouchable matriarch of the Vance family was completely destroyed. She covered her face with her hands, unable to look at the gallery, unable to face the reporters, who were frantically typing down every single word of her utter devastation. Near the back of the courtroom, Darnell decided he had heard enough. He knew his own fraudulent empire had already been seized by my shell companies, and now the full terrifying extent of my power was completely exposed. He slid out of his seat in the gallery, keeping his head down. He turned his back on his weeping wife and began inching slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors, trying to sneak out of the back of the courtroom, completely unnoticed. "Leaving so soon?" "Darnell," I called out, my voice slicing through the thick tension of the room like a razor blade. Darnell froze instantly. His hand hovered just inches from the brass door handle. He slowly turned around, his face dripping with cold, nervous sweat. The entire courtroom turned to look at him. "We have not even discussed whose baby Trey really is," I announced, letting the words detonate in the middle of the room. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Vivian lowered her hands from her face. She turned her head slowly, staring at Darnell with a look of profound, terrifying confusion. "What are you talking about?" Vivian demanded, her voice shaking with an unnatural calm. "What does Darnell have to do with Sasha's baby?" I turned my attention back to Sasha, who was trembling uncontrollably in the witness stand. Knowing that Elijah was 100% sterile, I took the liberty of running a cross-reference on the raw data from the DNA test Sasha submitted. I explained, projecting my voice so the judge could hear every detail. I compared the genetic markers to the extended family database. I wanted to see exactly how she managed to fake a positive paternity result. It turns out she did not fake the raw data. She just lied about which family member the DNA actually belonged to. Darnell pressed himself flat against the wooden door, looking like a trapped animal. Sasha sobbed loudly, burying her face in her arms. "You wanted a piece of the inheritance so badly, Sasha, that you slept with Vivian's husband?" I stated, my voice ringing with finality. "Trey is Darnell's son," Vivian snapped. The flawless facade of the perfect elite black family was entirely obliterated. Decades of carefully cultivated respectability and high society poise evaporated in a single blinding flash of pure, violent rage. Vivian let out a guttural, furious scream that echoed off the high ceiling. She lunged over the wooden railing, throwing herself directly at Darnell. She slammed her fists into his chest, driving him hard against the heavy doors. "You pathetic, worthless coward," Vivian screamed, hitting him again and again. "I gave you everything. I elevated you. I brought you into my family, and you betrayed me with this cheap, desperate fraud. You ruined my life." Darnell raised his arms, trying to shield his face from her relentless blows. "Vivian, please," he begged, stepping backward and tripping over his own feet. "It was a mistake. She meant nothing to me." Vivian grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive suit and shoved him violently against the wall. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the quiet courtroom. Judge Harrison immediately banged his gavel, shouting for order, but Vivian was operating on pure adrenaline and absolute devastation. The bailiffs rushed down the center aisle, attempting to separate them, but Vivian slapped Darnell across the face with tremendous force, leaving a bright red mark across his cheek. The elite judge, the untouchable sister, was physically brawling with her cheating husband in the middle of a federal probate hearing. I stood perfectly still, watching the empire they had built on my back burn to the ground. They had spent years trying to break me. They had coordinated a massive smear campaign. They had brought my own mother into this courtroom to commit perjury and completely destroy my good name. Now they were destroying each other right before my eyes. The poetic justice of this moment was incredibly sweet and profoundly satisfying to witness. In the midst of the incredibly violent and chaotic struggle happening at the back of the room, a sudden movement near the front bench caught my eye. Clarice Vance had slipped out of her chair in the gallery. My mother crawled across the polished floor, her pearl necklace swinging wildly against her chest. She dragged herself toward the respondents' table, completely ignoring the screaming matches and the struggling bailiffs. Clarice reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the hem of my charcoal gray suit jacket. She looked up at me, her face streaked with ruined makeup and desperate, horrifying realization. She knew she had committed federal perjury. She knew she had sold out her only daughter for a family that was currently imploding in public disgrace. "Maya, baby, please," Clarice cried, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "I did not know. They manipulated me. Vivian told me it was the only way to protect the family name. I thought I was doing the right thing. They tricked me, Maya. I am your mother. You have to help me. Please, baby." I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman clutching my jacket. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering desire for her maternal approval. The emotional cord had been completely and permanently severed. I reached down and slowly peeled her trembling fingers off my expensive suit. I looked at her with eyes like ice. "Sit down, Clarice," I commanded, my voice completely flat and devoid of any mercy. "I am not done with you yet." The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut as the armed security guards dragged a screaming Vivian out of the room. The chaotic echoes of her violent brawl with Darnell faded into the sprawling marble hallway. Inside the private conference room, the atmosphere became suffocatingly quiet. Darnell remained slumped against the wall, bleeding and completely broken. Sasha continued to weep softly into her hands, terrified of the impending federal perjury charges. I ignored all of them. My sharp gaze was entirely focused on the pathetic woman kneeling on the floor. Clarice was trembling uncontrollably, her expensive pearl necklace rattling against her chest. She looked absolutely terrified. For my entire life, she had dictated my worth based on her own shallow social aspirations. She had belittled my choices, mocked my appearance, and constantly reminded me that I was a massive disappointment. She had eagerly joined the Vance family in their vicious campaign to destroy my credibility, all to secure her precarious position within their elite inner circle. Now the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The daughter she had always rejected was standing above her, wearing a pristine $10,000 suit and holding the ultimate absolute authority over her entire future and freedom. "Maya, please listen to me," Clarice begged, her voice rising to a frantic, desperate pitch. "You have to understand my position. Vivian promised me that we would be perfectly secure if I testified against you. She swore that taking your money was the only logical way to maintain our dignity. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to survive in a world that demands perfection. You are my only child, Maya. You have to forgive me for making a terrible mistake. I am your mother. You cannot just leave me here to face this disaster completely alone." I did not offer her a hand to help her stand up. I simply looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of detached observation. It was fascinating to see how quickly her arrogant pride vanished when faced with absolute ruin. "You always spun a very convenient narrative, Clarice," I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the large room. "You told everyone that I funded my initial software development by taking out massive high-interest loans from predatory banks. You told Vivian that I was drowning in debt and entirely dependent on Elijah's generosity just to keep myself financially afloat." Clarice swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Mr. Sterling, who was still standing quietly near the granite table, observing the confrontation with professional detachment. "But we both know that story was completely false." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I never walked into a single bank to beg for seed money. I did not need to ask any corporate lenders for a business loan. I already had the necessary capital waiting for me. I possessed the foresight to track down the private trust fund that my late grandmother left specifically for my own future business endeavors. My grandmother was the only person in our entire lineage who actually believed in my intelligence. She worked incredibly hard her whole life, and she established that protected account to ensure I would always have an impenetrable safety net. She deliberately designed it as an orphaned account, meaning it was legally supposed to remain completely untouched until I reached the appropriate age to launch my career. She designated you as the temporary financial custodian because she foolishly assumed a mother would naturally protect her own child's inheritance. She severely underestimated your overwhelming obsession with obtaining superficial elite high society status. Clarice began to shake, her eyes widening as the deeply buried truth was ruthlessly dragged into the bright light. When I finally went to the bank to formally claim my rightful inheritance, I received a shocking revelation. I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet room. The account manager informed me that the funds had been systematically drained. Every single dollar was gone. I spent 2 months working with an aggressive forensic accountant, meticulously tracing the fraudulent wire transfers. I watched my entire financial legacy completely evaporate into a shameful digital paper trail of unauthorized, reckless, and highly illegal withdrawals. You took everything, Clarice. You siphoned out exactly $250,000. It was a staggering amount of money that was supposed to secure my independence. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out a blue folder, tossing it onto the table right next to the original Aegis Nexus Incorporation documents. The folder slid across the polished granite, stopping mere inches from her trembling hands. The undeniable bank records, the forged authorization signatures, and the detailed expense reports were all inside. You thought I would never discover your crime because you assumed I would always remain completely impoverished. Maya, I needed it, Clarice stammered desperately, tears ruining her foundation. We were completely struggling. We had no connections. I had to secure our future. I did not steal it. I borrowed it. I was going to pay you back eventually. I promise. I scoffed loudly, the sound echoing with sharp, absolute disgust. You did not borrow anything to secure our future, Clarice. I saw the receipts. I saw exactly where the money went. You did not buy a house or invest in a stable business. You bought your pathetic way into an exclusive circle that always secretly despised you. You desperately craved Vivian's approval, I stated mercilessly. You wanted to sit at her fancy dinner tables and attend her luxurious galas. So you opened your own daughter's secure trust fund and completely drained it to sponsor Vivian's lavish social events. You paid for the expensive caterers. You covered the ridiculous floral arrangements. You financed the extravagant charity auctions. You bought your invitation to the country club using my stolen inheritance. You handed over my financial security just so Vivian would finally stop ignoring you and invite you to drink champagne on her exclusive private yacht for the summer holidays. But that was not even the worst part of your betrayal, Clarice. I continued, watching Sasha, who was now frozen in absolute terror at the far end of the room. You wanted Vivian to respect you so much that you eagerly agreed to fund her latest pet project. You personally wrote a massive $50,000 check to cover every single expense for Sasha's extravagant debutante ball. You bought her custom designer gowns. You paid for her luxurious venue. You literally financed the incredibly shallow lifestyle of the exact same woman who was secretly sleeping with your best friend's husband. Clarice looked physically ill as the horrifying irony finally registered. She had unknowingly funded the exact mistress who had destroyed the powerful family she was desperately trying to impress. She glanced at Vivian, who was now staring at my mother with a mixture of absolute disgust and burning fury. The elite socialite realized that her new best friend was nothing but a pathetic thief. I took another step forward, ensuring my mother had nowhere left to run or hide. You stole $250,000 from an orphaned account to fund a stranger's lifestyle because you were ashamed of me, I stated coldly. Clarice broke down completely, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. She reached out and desperately grabbed my arm again, her acrylic nails digging into the pristine white fabric of my expensive suit. She was entirely frantic, her voice breaking into a loud, hysterical sob that echoed off the cold granite walls. I'm your mother. You have $300 million. What does $250,000 matter now? Clarice begs. She looked up at me with wild, pleading eyes, truly believing that our shared biological connection would somehow magically erase her unforgivable, massive financial crimes entirely here today. I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a profound, icy emptiness. The woman kneeling before me was a complete stranger. She was a hollow shell of greed and social desperation. I did not flinch as she cried. I did not offer her a single shred of comfort. I simply turned my head slightly and locked eyes with the man standing quietly near the massive glass windows. I signaled my lawyer. He immediately opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official federal documents, placing them deliberately on the smooth stone surface of the granite table. The documents contained the fully executed forensic audit and the sworn affidavits from the bank managers. Clarice stared at the terrifying paperwork, her desperate sobbing slowly fading into a shocked, breathless silence. She finally realized that she was not just facing public social humiliation, she was facing federal prison. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from her terrified eyes, ensuring she heard every single syllable of her impending doom clearly. It matters, because the IRS considers it embezzlement. And I filed the police report yesterday. Clarice collapsed onto the floor, completely ruined as the authorities finally arrived here today. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom burst open, and a swarm of uniformed police officers flooded into the chaotic space. Their heavy boots thundered against the polished hardwood floor, instantly cutting through the lingering echoes of my mother crying. Judge Harrison was still standing behind his elevated bench. His face flushed red with indignation as he furiously banged his wooden gavel to demand order. But the absolute destruction of the Vance family had already been completed. The elite atmosphere was entirely shattered, leaving behind only the incredibly messy remnants of their massive greed and their deeply embarrassing public desperation. Two burly officers immediately surrounded Darnell, who was still slumped against the back wall, bleeding from the vicious deep scratches on his face. He did not even try to resist the authorities. His expensive tailored suit hung in torn strips, displaying a perfectly accurate reflection of his newly annihilated corporate facade. He looked up at the approaching officers with hollow, defeated eyes, holding his heavily bruised cheek. He looked absolutely terrified, knowing that his entire fraudulent life had just spectacularly collapsed. The smug, arrogant confidence he usually projected had completely vanished, replaced by a cowardly, shivering sense of dread. A serious detective stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Darnell Vance, you are officially under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement and multiple counts of criminal wire fraud," the lead detective announced, reading loudly from a printed warrant. My lawyer had ensured that the authorities received all the digital evidence proving Darnell had deliberately drained corporate funds from my hidden shell companies. Darnell groaned softly as the tight handcuffs bit deeply into his wrists. He squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to look at his furious wife or the utterly shocked, gaping gallery members standing nearby. He had tried to steal my wealth, but instead he had unwittingly orchestrated his own spectacularly painful public demise. My lead corporate attorney, Mr. Sterling, stepped forward with immaculate British poise. He completely ignored the frantic screaming and the physical brawling that had just desecrated the sanctity of the federal probate court. He approached the lead detective, calmly opening his sleek leather briefcase. He produced the bright blue folder containing the fake genetic test and the fabricated last will document. He handed the damning folder directly to the detective, ensuring the devastating physical evidence was fully, securely, legally transferred today. "Officer," my lawyer said, his crisp voice carrying effortlessly across the tense room, "I am formally submitting irrefutable evidence of a massive federal crime today. The woman weeping in the witness stand has deliberately submitted forged legal documents in a highly calculated attempt to extort a $300 million corporate estate. This action constitutes severe federal perjury, aggressive wire fraud, and a direct criminal conspiracy." Sasha gasped loudly, her tear-stained face shooting up from her trembling hands. She realized that her brilliant malicious plan had spectacularly failed, and she was now facing decades behind cold steel bars forever. Two female police officers marched directly toward the witness stand. They did not show a single ounce of pity for the weeping, beautiful woman sitting before them. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back, one," officer commanded sternly. Sasha shook her head frantically, her elaborate hair extensions flying wildly around her shoulders. "Please, no!" she shrieked, clutching the wooden railing. "I am the victim here. Maya set me up. I did not know the documents were forged. Darnell told me they were real. He gave them to me." The officers ignored her desperate, pathetic lying and advanced quickly. They hauled Sasha up onto her feet forcefully, twisting her slender arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping securely into place echoed loudly across the silent, shocked courtroom. Sasha writhed against their strong grip, her expensive designer dress tearing slightly at the delicate shoulder seam. She looked absolutely wretched, stripped of her usual confident elegance, and exposed as a common opportunistic criminal. Her wailing grew louder, bouncing off the wooden walls as she desperately tried to bargain with the stoic officers. She offered fake apologies and empty promises, but nobody cared anymore today. With both criminals securely restrained, the police aggressively marched them down the center aisle of the courtroom. The gallery erupted into chaotic, excited whispers and furious camera clicks. Reporters shoved their digital recorders forward, trying to capture the historic downfall of our most pretentious social climbers. The flashing cameras illuminated their tear-stained, ruined faces, capturing their ultimate humiliation for the evening news. The once untouchable elites were now reduced to common felons, walking the shameful path of public disgrace. The sheer magnitude of their complete failure was perfectly documented for the entire world to witness and mock forever today. Vivian stood completely frozen near the plaintiff table. Her perfect, upright posture had collapsed entirely, leaving her hunched and trembling like a frightened child. She was left entirely alone in the center of the vast legal arena. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her mistress adversary was wearing steel handcuffs. Her immense generational wealth had evaporated completely. The social standing she had ruthlessly protected was now permanently annihilated. Her prominent law career was over, and her private personal finances were entirely frozen by my legal team. She was a hollow ghost haunting the ruins of her own tragic creation. She stared at me from across the open floor, looking utterly broken. Her eyes were completely devoid of their usual condescending fire, replaced only by the hollow, empty realization of her own monumental defeat. She finally understood that I was never the weak, vulnerable target she had always assumed. I was the silent apex predator, and she had unknowingly wandered straight into my carefully laid golden trap many long years ago. The mighty judge who had ordered everyone around for decades was now absolutely speechless, drowning in the bitter, toxic ocean of her own massive, blinding hubris forever starting today. I did not smile at her. I simply offered a very slight acknowledging nod, cementing my absolute total victory over her entire existence. She had tried to erase me, but I had erased her instead. As the aggressive police officers aggressively dragged Sasha forcefully past my table, the disgraced mistress suddenly stopped fighting. She dug her high heels into the smooth floor, resisting their pull just long enough to turn her tear-stained face directly toward me. Her eyes were burning with a wild, desperate malice. She glared at me like a cornered, extremely rabid, wild, deeply violent, helpless animal. The loud echoes of her furious screaming bounced off the high ceilings of the expansive federal courtroom. The gallery members gasped in shock, pointing their fingers and whispering rapidly among themselves. Sasha continued to thrash wildly against the firm grasp of the two large police officers. Her perfect manicured nails clawed uselessly at the cold metal handcuffs binding her wrists tightly together. She kicked her feet out furiously, sending one of her expensive designer shoes flying across the polished wooden floor. It hit the base of the judge's bench with a loud, pathetic thud that finalized her total downfall today. I stood perfectly still, watching the pathetic display of absolute ruin unfolding right before my eyes. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaotic, frantic energy consuming the disgraced woman. She looked absolutely wretched, stripped of her usual confident elegance and exposed as a common opportunistic criminal. Her wailing grew louder, bouncing off the wooden walls as she desperately tried to bargain with the stoic officers. She offered fake apologies and empty promises, but nobody cared anymore. The officers forcefully yanked her forward, dragging her toward the heavy double doors, leading out to the harsh, cold, unforgiving legal reality outside. As they pulled her forcefully past my table, she suddenly stopped fighting. She dug her remaining heel into the smooth floor, resisting their pull just long enough to turn her tear-stained face directly toward me. Her eyes were burning with a wild, desperate malice. She glared at me like a cornered, extremely rabid, wild, violent animal, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the massive trap I had meticulously built around her. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I simply smoothed the pristine white fabric of my expensive tailored suit jacket, standing incredibly flawlessly tall. Sasha screams as she is taken away. "You planned this! You let me think I was winning!" I lean in close. "I didn't build a $300 million empire by playing checkers, Sasha. I play chess." The police aggressively yanked her backward, dragging her out of the large doors. Her furious shrieks echoed down the long hallway, slowly fading away until they were completely gone. The courtroom was finally silent. My massive victory was perfectly absolute and deeply satisfying. The elite family that tried to bury me was now entirely destroyed, forever burning in the ashes of their own magnificent greed. Clarice crumpled onto the polished wooden floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror vibrating in my voice. She pulled her trembling knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as she backed away from my towering presence. She finally recognized that the submissive, obedient daughter she had spent decades actively tearing down had been entirely eradicated. I turned my sharp gaze away from her pathetic, shivering form, completely dismissing her existence as the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the courtroom suddenly burst open with explosive, terrifying force. A massive swarm of uniformed police officers flooded into the chaotic space, their heavy black boots thundering aggressively against the hardwood floor. The loud, commanding sound instantly sliced through the lingering echoes of the brutal physical brawl unfolding in the center aisle. Judge Harrison was still standing furiously behind his elevated judicial bench, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson with supreme indignation as he relentlessly banged his wooden gavel, demanding immediate order. But the absolute pristine sanctity of his federal probate court had already been permanently shattered by the deeply embarrassing public desperation of the Vance family. Two incredibly burly police officers immediately surged forward, plunging directly into the violent struggle. They aggressively grabbed Vivian, pulling her forcefully away from her bleeding husband. Vivian screamed like a wild, feral animal, her flawless, expensive silk blouse torn at the collar and her carefully pinned hair completely undone. She thrashed wildly against the strong grip of the arresting officers, her chest heaving as she spat vicious, furious curses at Darnell. Darnell remained slumped heavily against the thick wooden pews, bleeding profusely from the vicious, deep scratches Vivian had relentlessly carved across his cheek. He did not even try to resist the authorities. His expensive tailored designer suit hung in pathetic torn strips, displaying a perfectly accurate physical reflection of his newly annihilated corporate facade. He looked up at the approaching officers with hollow, deeply defeated eyes, holding his heavily bruised face. He looked absolutely terrified, knowing with absolute certainty that his entire fraudulent, privileged life had just spectacularly collapsed into nothingness. The smug, arrogant confidence he usually projected with such irritating ease had completely vanished entirely, replaced by a cowardly, shivering sense of impending doom. A serious veteran detective stepped forward purposefully, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather utility belt. The sharp metallic clinking sound echoed ominously across the tense, silent room, causing Darnell to flinch violently. "Darnell Vance, you are officially under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement and multiple counts of severe criminal wire fraud," the lead detective announced, reading loudly and clearly from a freshly printed federal warrant. My lead corporate attorney, Mr. Sterling, stepped forward with immaculate British poise. He had meticulously ensured that the authorities received all the digital financial evidence, proving Darnell had deliberately drained corporate funds from my hidden shell companies. He approached the lead detective, calmly opening his sleek leather briefcase to present the final physical copies of the financial audits. Darnell groaned softly, a pathetic broken sound as the tight steel handcuffs bit deeply into his wrists. He squeezed his eyes shut completely, refusing to look at his furious, screaming wife or the utterly shocked, gaping gallery members standing nearby. He had arrogantly tried to steal my immense generational wealth, but instead, he had unwittingly orchestrated his own spectacularly painful public demise. The officers forcefully hoisted him to his feet, his legs wobbling uncontrollably under the crushing weight of his absolute failure. Mr. Sterling did not stop there. He completely ignored the frantic screaming and the physical brawling that had just desecrated the prestigious room. He turned his attention back to the detective, producing a bright blue folder containing the raw data from the fake genetic paternity test and the completely fabricated last will and testament document. He handed the damning folder directly to the detective, ensuring the devastating physical evidence was securely legally transferred to the proper federal authorities today. "Officer," my lawyer said, his crisp, professional voice carrying effortlessly across the incredibly tense room, "I am formally submitting irrefutable physical evidence of a massive federal crime. The woman currently weeping in the witness stand has deliberately submitted forged legal documents in a highly calculated, premeditated attempt to extort a $300 million corporate estate. This blatant action constitutes severe federal perjury, aggressive wire fraud, and a direct criminal conspiracy to commit grand larceny." Sasha gasped loudly, her tear-stained, ruined face shooting up from her trembling hands. She realized in one blinding, horrifying instant that her brilliant, malicious master plan had spectacularly failed, and she was now facing decades behind cold steel bars. Two female police officers marched directly toward the elevated wooden witness stand. They did not show a single ounce of pity or compassion for the weeping, beautiful woman sitting helplessly before them. "Stand up and place your hands firmly behind your back," one officer commanded sternly, her voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. Sasha shook her head frantically, her elaborate, expensive hair extensions flying wildly around her bare shoulders. "Please, no!" she shrieked, clutching the wooden railing of the witness box with white-knuckled desperation. "I am the victim here. Maya set me up. I did not know the documents were forged. Darnell told me they were absolutely real. He gave them to me. He promised me we would be rich." The officers completely ignored her desperate, pathetic lying and advanced quickly up the short wooden steps. They hauled Sasha forcefully up onto her feet, twisting her slender arms behind her back with practiced clinical efficiency. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping securely into place echoed loudly across the silent, shocked courtroom. Sasha writhed violently against their strong grip, her expensive designer dress tearing slightly at the delicate shoulder seam. She looked absolutely wretched, completely stripped of her usual confident, seductive elegance and exposed to the entire world as a common, opportunistic criminal. Her wailing grew significantly louder, bouncing aggressively off the high wooden walls as she desperately tried to bargain with the stoic, unforgiving officers. She offered fake, tearful apologies and empty promises claiming she would testify against Darnell if they just let her walk away. But nobody cared anymore. With both criminals securely restrained, the police aggressively marched them down the center aisle of the large courtroom. The gallery erupted into chaotic, excited whispers and furious, rapid camera clicks. Reporters who had managed to sneak into the back rows shoved their digital recorders forward frantically, trying to capture the historic, epic downfall of the city's most pretentious social climbers. The flashing camera lights illuminated their tear-stained, ruined faces, capturing their ultimate humiliation for the evening news cycle. The once untouchable, arrogant elites were now reduced to common felons, walking the shameful, deeply embarrassing path of public disgrace. The sheer magnitude of their complete failure was perfectly documented for the entire world to witness and mock forever. As the chaotic noise of the arrest slowly faded into the long marble hallway, the atmosphere inside the massive room shifted into a suffocating, profound silence. Vivian stood completely frozen near the plaintiff table. Her perfect upright regal posture had collapsed entirely, leaving her hunched and trembling like a frightened, confused child. She was left entirely alone in the center of the vast legal arena. Her husband was going to federal prison for embezzlement. Her mistress adversary was wearing steel handcuffs for perjury. Her immense generational wealth had evaporated completely into thin air. The elite social standing she had ruthlessly protected and weaponized for decades was now permanently annihilated. Her prominent, respected law career was completely over, and her private personal finances were entirely frozen by my aggressive legal team. She was a hollow ghost, haunting the absolute ruins of her own tragic, narcissistic creation. She stared across the open floor, looking utterly, completely broken. Her dark eyes were entirely devoid of their usual condescending, fiery arrogance, replaced only by the hollow, empty realization of her own monumental, catastrophic defeat. She finally understood that I was never the weak, vulnerable target she had always arrogantly assumed. I was the silent apex predator, and she had unknowingly, blindly wandered straight into my carefully laid golden trap many long years ago. The mighty, untouchable matriarch who had ordered everyone around with absolute impunity was now completely speechless, drowning in the bitter, toxic ocean of her own massive, blinding hubris. I did not smile at her. I did not gloat or boast. I simply stared back at her, standing perfectly, incredibly tall in my pristine, tailored suit, offering a very slight acknowledging nod, cementing my absolute, total victory over her entire existence. She had tried to erase me, but I had erased her instead. The profound silence stretching between us was the loudest declaration of power I had ever delivered. Every single insult she had ever hurled at me, every condescending glance, every cruel, manipulative plot had culminated in this exact, devastating moment. She had absolutely nothing left to fight with. As the aggressive police officers forcefully dragged Sasha past the heavy wooden swinging doors, the disgraced mistress suddenly stopped fighting the inevitable. She dug her sharp high heels deeply into the smooth, polished floor, aggressively resisting their powerful pull, just long enough to turn her tear-stained, ruined face directly toward me. Her dark eyes were burning with a wild, desperate, malicious fury. She glared at me like a cornered, extremely rabid, wild, violent animal, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the massive, inescapable trap I had meticulously built perfectly around her. "You planned this!" Sasha screamed, her vocal cords straining, as her furious, high-pitched voice sliced violently through the heavy, quiet atmosphere of the courtroom. "You let me think I was winning." I stepped slowly around the edge of the plaintiff table, my heels clicking with deliberate, measured precision against the hardwood floor. I approached the struggling, weeping woman, looking absolutely flawless and entirely unbothered by her chaotic, frantic, emotional outburst. The police officers paused for just a fraction of a second, unsure of my intentions. I stopped mere inches from Sasha's tear-streaked face, staring directly into her panicked, terrified eyes. The sweet, innocent facade I had maintained for years was completely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a billionaire visionary who had just successfully executed the most elaborate corporate and personal takeover in the history of the city. I leaned in close, lowering my voice so that only she could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "I didn't build a $300 million empire by playing checkers, Sasha. I play chess." The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off Sasha's screams. The absolute silence that settled over the courtroom was profoundly heavy. I stood perfectly still, smoothing the lapels of my white suit. The gallery remained frozen in their seats, too terrified to whisper or move. I turned my back on the plaintiff table, walking slowly down the center aisle. My heels clicked with terrifying precision against the hardwood floor. Every person parted respectfully, clearing a wide path for me. I did not look back at the shattered remnants of the Vance family. I stepped out into the bright sunlight, breathing the clean air of absolute victory. 3 days later, I stood in the marble foyer of the sprawling estate my mother had occupied for the past decade. The property sat on 5 pristine acres in the most exclusive local zip code. Elijah allowed her to live here rent-free, assuming it would buy her maternal affection. He was completely wrong. The house was registered under my anonymous holding companies, making me the sole owner. I arrived unannounced, carrying a sleek black folder containing the final eviction notices. The grand house was eerily quiet, stripped of its usual chaotic social energy. The expensive catering staff and private maids had already fled, sensing the impending financial ruin. Clarice descended the sweeping grand staircase looking absolutely dreadful. Her signature perfectly coiffed hair was flat and dull. She wore a simple beige robe, a stark contrast to the designer gowns she usually paraded around in. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, heavily bruised by consecutive sleepless nights. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands, pausing halfway down the carpeted stairs when she saw me standing in the foyer. The desperate, panicked energy that had consumed her in the courtroom was now replaced by a pathetic, hollow exhaustion. She knew her impending federal embezzlement trial was unwinnable. My legal team had secured ironclad financial records proving she stole my private inheritance. She was looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. "Maya," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. "You came. I knew you would come. You are a good daughter." I remained standing near the heavy mahogany front door, refusing to step further into the house. "I am not here for a sentimental family reunion, Clarice," I stated coldly. "I am here to finalize the legal paperwork regarding this property." Clarice stumbled down the remaining stairs, rushing toward me with desperate, pleading eyes. She reached out, trying to grab my hands, but I took a sharp step backward. "Please, Maya, you have to stop this," she begged, tears spilling over her pale cheeks. "You have to call the federal prosecutors. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. You have all the money in the world now. You own Aegis Nexus. You are a billionaire. You do not need to send your own mother to a cold, miserable prison cell." I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. "You stole $250,000 from an orphaned trust account," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You forged documents. You committed federal wire fraud. I did not force you to commit those crimes, Clarice. You made those selfish choices entirely on your own, just so you could buy your pathetic way into Vivian's elite social circle." Clarice sobbed loudly, falling to her knees on the expensive imported marble floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth in pure terror. "I was just trying to survive," she cried out. "I wanted us to be respected. I wanted to give you a respectable name. I sacrificed everything for you, Maya. I gave you life. I gave you life, and this is how you repay me." I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman, realizing she still completely lacked any genuine remorse. She was only sorry that she had finally been caught. I crouched down slightly, bringing my face level with hers. My gaze was like sharp, shattered ice. "You gave me life, but you gave Sasha my future. I just took it back." Clarice gasped, shrinking away from my cold, unforgiving stare. She realized in that exact moment that the emotional manipulation she had successfully utilized for decades no longer worked on me. The invisible chains of maternal guilt had been permanently shattered. I stood back up, towering over her weeping form. I unclasped the sleek black leather folder I had brought with me and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents. "These are your formal eviction notices," I announced, dropping the heavy papers onto the marble floor right in front of her trembling hands. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate this property completely. I have officially severed all financial ties with you. My holding company will no longer pay the property taxes, the utility bills, or the expensive landscaping fees. You are entirely cut off from my wealth." Clarice stared at the eviction papers in absolute horror. "Where will I go?" she whimpered. "I have no money. The federal authorities froze my personal bank accounts. I have absolutely nothing left, Maya." "You have the elite social titles you care so much about," I replied, turning my back on her. "You can ask your high society friends for a place to stay. Let us see how much they truly value your friendship now that your wallet is completely empty." I walked out of the sprawling estate, leaving the heavy mahogany door wide open behind me. I climbed into the back of my waiting chauffeured car, instructing my driver to head directly to Vivian's luxury penthouse in the city. It was time to deliver the second set of eviction notices. Vivian's downfall had been incredibly swift and profoundly brutal. After the explosive courtroom brawl, the elite legal community had immediately ostracized her. Her prestigious law firm demanded her immediate resignation to protect their pristine corporate reputation. Her wealthy, snobbish friends blocked her phone number, refusing to associate with a disgraced woman whose husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. The grand, luxurious life she had ruthlessly built was entirely funded by the corporate dividends she had unknowingly stolen from my company. I had instructed my brilliant legal team to immediately sever every single financial cord. My car pulled up to the glittering glass skyscraper downtown. I bypassed the nervous concierge and took the private elevator directly to the penthouse floor. I did not bother knocking. I used the master override key the building management had provided to the legal property owner. The massive penthouse was in a state of absolute frantic chaos. Cardboard moving boxes were scattered randomly across the expensive Persian rugs. Vivian was frantically stuffing designer clothes and priceless jewelry into large leather suitcases. She looked completely unhinged. Her flawless makeup was heavily smeared, and her expensive silk blouse was stained with spilled wine. "Get out of my house!" Vivian shrieked, hurling a crystal vase against the wall when she saw me standing in the doorway. The expensive glass shattered into 1,000 tiny glittering pieces across the hardwood floor. "This is not your house, Vivian," I corrected, stepping carefully over the broken glass. "I bought this penthouse through a silent proxy 3 years ago. You have been living in my property." I dropped the second set of eviction papers onto her messy dining table. "You have 24 hours to clear out your belongings. The building security team has been instructed to forcibly remove you if you miss the strict deadline." Vivian stared at the official legal documents, her hands shaking violently. "You ruined my entire life!" she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute raw devastation. "You destroyed my perfect family. You sent my husband to jail. You stripped me of my incredible wealth. You are a monster, Maya." I smiled a cold, merciless smile. "I simply stopped paying for your fabricated reality, Vivian," I replied softly. "You destroyed yourself. You built a magnificent, glittering castle on a foundation of massive lies and breathtaking arrogance. I just removed the supporting pillars." I turned and walked away, leaving the disgraced, untouchable matriarch completely alone in the ruins of her fake empire. I rode the private elevator down to the busy lobby, feeling an incredible, immense sense of absolute freedom. The heavy, toxic burdens I had carried for over a decade were finally gone. I stepped out through the rotating glass doors onto the bustling city sidewalk. The bright afternoon sunlight warmed my face. A small crowd of aggressive journalists and flashing cameras had already gathered near my waiting car, tipped off about the massive corporate scandal rocking the city. A bold, ambitious reporter shoved a microphone toward me, blocking my path to the car door. "Mrs. Vance," the eager news reporter shouted over the chaotic, noisy crowd. "With Darnell Vance facing federal prison time and your mother facing severe embezzlement charges, what will you now do with your late husband's legacy and..."